I wasn't looking for any trouble that morning. All I wanted was to find out why three unfamiliar people were standing in my hayfield with surveying equipment. Within 5 minutes, I discovered that my HOA had secretly leased my farmland for $8 million. The money itself wasn't what upset me. What bothered me was that everyone involved acted as though I had already approved the deal. And when I finally found out whose name was on the paperwork, I made one phone call that changed everything. My name is Russell. I'm 63 years old, and I've spent most of my life working this farm. My father taught me how to drive a tractor in that very hayfield. My grandfather put up the first fence posts with his own hands, long before any neighborhood was built out here. 3 generations of my family worked this land, and never once did I think someone could make decisions about it without even asking me. Looking back now, the warning signs had been there all along. I just never connected them. One board member kept asking strangely detailed questions about exactly where my property lines were. Another meeting agenda included a small item about underused community assets. A committee vote was postponed, then quietly disappeared from the meeting minutes. Small things that were easy to overlook. At the time, I ignored every one of them. So when I saw 2 unfamiliar trucks parked near my back fence that morning, I assumed it was the county checking utility lines again. I walked over in my boots with a cup of coffee and asked the nearest worker what they were doing. "Getting ready for the project," he replied without looking up. "What project?" I asked. He looked at me as if he couldn't understand why I was asking. "The one your HOA leased this land for, sir." I honestly thought he had the wrong property. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" He checked his clipboard, frowned for a second, then looked back at me with an even more confused expression. "This is the parcel listed here. Sweetwater Ridge Estates leased it for the development project." We stood there for a moment, each convinced the other was mistaken. Behind him, orange survey flags stretched across my hayfield in neat rows, marking land for a project I had never approved and didn't even know existed. At that point, I still had no idea how much money was involved. If someone had told me the lease was worth $8 million, I would have laughed because it sounded impossible. I walked back into the house and called the HOA office, expecting a simple misunderstanding that would be cleared up in minutes. Instead, I heard a calm, confident voice telling me everything had already been signed, approved, and finalized. According to them, the deal was done. The only question left was the one that kept me awake that night. Whose signature was on those papers? And why did I have the feeling it belonged to someone I should have trusted? The voice belonged to Diane, the HOA board secretary, and she sounded far too comfortable discussing a lease on land that wasn't hers. "Russell," she said warmly, as though I had called about something routine. "I figured you'd contact us sooner or later." "Diane," I replied, "there are survey crews standing in my hayfield right now." "Yes," she answered casually. "The project, the board approved it back in March. Everything is documented." "Approved what exactly?" I asked. "The lease," she said, as though it should have been obvious. "For the solar development, $8 million over 20 years. It's a wonderful opportunity for the entire community." I slowly sat down. "You leased my farmland." There was a short pause before she answered. "Well, technically, our records list that parcel as shared community acreage." "It isn't shared," I said. "My family has owned that land for 3 generations." "Well," she replied, sounding more confident again, "an older survey places it within our easement boundary. The board relied on those records." I asked her to send me everything, the lease, the survey, and the meeting minutes. She agreed almost immediately. That should have been my first clue. Within the hour, my inbox filled with emails written in cheerful, confident language. One described the lease as an incredible opportunity for Sweetwater Ridge. Another thanked me in advance for my cooperation, as though I had already agreed to something I hadn't even known about that morning. A little later, Carl called. He was another member of the HOA board, eager to explain how the project would increase property values for everyone in the neighborhood. I let him talk for about a minute before stopping him. "Carl," I said, "who actually signed the lease? I want the name." He hesitated. "I believe that was handled at the board level," he replied. "That's not a name." "I'd have to check," he said, his voice suddenly much quieter than before. That hesitation told me everything I needed to know. Someone had signed away my family's land, attached an $8 million agreement to it, and nobody on the current HOA board seemed willing to say who had signed the paperwork. So I drove to the county records office myself. I figured official documents don't get nervous when you ask questions. What I found inside that file made my stomach sink. The signature at the bottom of the lease didn't just belong to someone I didn't recognize. It belonged to a man who had been dead for nearly 2 years. That left only one possible explanation. Someone had forged his signature. I stood there in the records office, holding the lease in my hands, staring at the name of a man who was no longer alive. At that moment, I knew exactly who I needed to call. Not Diane, not Carl, the county sheriff's office. I calmly explained everything. I told them about the survey crew, the $8 million lease, the farmland that had never belonged to the HOA, and the signature of a man who had passed away 2 years earlier. The deputy on the phone became very quiet. Then he asked one question that changed everything. "Sir, do you still have a copy of that document?" "I have the original right here," I answered. "Don't let it out of your possession," he said. "We're sending someone over today." Later that afternoon, a sheriff's deputy and an investigator from the district attorney's office arrived at my farmhouse. They photographed the lease, the survey markers in the field, and every email Diane and Carl had sent me. The investigator explained that forging signatures on real estate documents wasn't simply an administrative mistake. It was a felony. News travels quickly in a small community. By the following morning, the HOA scheduled an emergency board meeting. I wasn't invited. Still, Carl called me again. The confidence he had shown the day before had completely disappeared. "Russell," he said, "I think there's been a serious misunderstanding." "There certainly has," I replied. "Someone forged a dead man's signature to lease my farmland." The silence that followed made it clear he understood exactly how serious the situation had become. Within a week, investigators traced the forged signature back to the HOA's former treasurer, a man named Walter. He had quietly stepped down from the board 2 years earlier, around the same time the original landowner, whose name appeared on the lease, had passed away. According to the investigation, Walter had kept partial access to old HOA files even after leaving the board. He used the deceased man's identity to push the lease through, planning to collect a consulting fee from the solar company once the agreement was finalized. As soon as the forgery was uncovered, the lease was suspended. The survey crews packed up their equipment and left my property within days. The solar company, worried about the legal consequences, quickly separated itself from the entire deal. It also launched its own investigation into how the HOA had approved a lease on land it never legally owned or controlled. Meanwhile, the HOA board that had once acted so confident spent meeting after meeting pointing fingers at one another while angry homeowners demanded answers. Diane resigned. Carl stopped answering his phone. Walter was arrested and charged with forgery and attempted fraud. A few months later, one of the remaining board members actually contacted me with an unexpected question. He asked whether I would consider joining the HOA committee again, saying my experience and perspective would be valuable. I laughed and gave him my answer. I'd rather lease my tractor to a raccoon. That ended the conversation. These days, my hayfield is exactly what it has always been meant to be. There are no orange survey stakes, no unfamiliar trucks, no strangers walking across my land with clipboards in their hands. Just peaceful mornings, a fresh cup of coffee, and the same fields my family has cared for through 3 generations. The land is finally, unquestionably mine again. Looking back, I still think about how close I came to losing something that had been part of my family's history for decades. Not because I chose to sell it, but because a handful of people assumed they could make that decision for me. If I had ignored those survey crews that morning, or trusted the paperwork without asking questions, the outcome could have been very different. Instead, one forged signature exposed an entire scheme, stopped an $8 million deal, and reminded everyone involved that no HOA, no board, and no individual has the right to take what doesn't belong to them. Sometimes the biggest battles don't begin with lawyers or courtrooms. Sometimes they begin with a simple question asked in your own hayfield. And I'm glad I asked it.